I live in Thailand, but not as an English teacher, NGO worker, or a professional of any kind. I'm a local Thai, so if you're expecting some ladyboy joke from the title, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I feel like I should let you foreigners know about what I encountered last weekend. I know foreigners don't normally believe in the supernatural, but I believe this subreddit is different. People come here to listen to extraordinary accounts because it's true, right? So please listen to my story. This knowledge might save your life when you next visit Thailand. I lurk on Reddit because it entertains me to read about other parts of the world. I'm just an office worker living in the capital city of Bangkok, wearing a tie, working on Excel, always being scolded by my American boss. But my home is in the rural countryside, lots of green paddy fields and sugar palms in the distance with the backdrop of gray hills. I was raised there by my parents who are rice farmers. I used to bring their buffaloes to graze in the fields just so I could doze all day on its sturdy back. It is a place of my nostalgia. As an office worker, I try to visit my parents as often as I can because they're old now, much too old for farm work. But still, they wouldn't lay their hands. Imagine if you're 60 but have to hunch over the field under a scorching sun to plant the rice stalks all day from dawn to dusk. Anyway, I visit just so I can bring some joy to their hearts and hand them a little souvenir from the city. Usually it's a little bit of money I can spare after paying for my rent, but when I am running short, I would buy them some American sweets or cookies that I'm pretty sure they've never tasted before. So it is this past weekend that things became strange and terrifying. I could barely believe it if it hadn't happened to myself. If my uncle or auntie from the village told me that they'd seen what I'd seen, I would nod politely and secretly deride them for their superstition. But now that it happened to myself, I don't know what to believe. Last Saturday, I planned to visit my parents early in the morning, but my boss told me that he needs his PowerPoint done by 3 p.m. Just perfect. It would take me 5 hours to travel from Bangkok to my hometown by train, and the last one leaves at 2 p.m. So I went into his office and worked like I never worked before. I skipped lunch and turned out the PowerPoint and immediately rushed to the train station. I barely made it in time to board the train. However, that means that I will have to walk to my parents' home when it's dark. And that makes me nervous. It is known that no one should walk around after dark in my village. Now before you criticize me, I'm not a superstitious man. I'm a city dweller, an office worker, a man of science. I'm more scared of physical threats like being mugged or murdered, even if it's unlikely to happen in the lonely, quiet track to my parents' house. The nervousness comes from my upbringing. In my village and many others in Thailand, we believe in folk tales and ghosts. Instead of a doctor, my parents would bring me to a shaman whenever I'm ill. When I was suffering from the dengue fever at the 13th year of my life, the old crone of a shaman had crouched over me with her teeth stained black from betel nuts, breathing over me with a sickly sweet stench. She then declared that I was plagued by a malevolent ghost who would soon kill me if it wasn't appeased. My parents immediately cooked up a feast and brought the offerings to pray before the local banyan tree, lighting candles and asking monks to perform a prayer service. They said that cured me and was the reason I am alive today. Of course, I don't believe them now. I know that dengue fever is caused by a virus transmitted by a mosquito. But still, once you are raised in that kind of belief, it is hard to shake it off. All throughout the slow trudging train journey, then the bus journey on the winding road through the darkening countryside, I couldn't find a comfortable seat. I kept fidgeting, shifting around, checking my phones over and over. I told my parents that I would arrive late, and they told me that it might be better if I moved my visit to the next weekend. I then told them that I'm already on the train, and they told me that it's better if I spend the night at the train station. I grunted and didn't reply. I was determined to make the journey that very night. I wanted to surprise them. I wanted to prove the village wrong. I was determined to visit them and prove that village belief was outdated, to make a difference with my superior beliefs from the city. Looking back, I realized now that I was just using those excuses to calm my fears, because when I got off the bus around 8 p.m. and saw the track leading through the paddy fields towards my parents' house, in the darkness all my reasons became flimsy and fragile. We had streetlights only on the main road, but nothing on the minor trails. I felt a childhood fear tugging at my heart. Why didn't I listen to my parents, I thought. Without thinking, I picked up my phone and called them again, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. Usually I would get a 3G internet even when I'm out here. I blamed the signal failure. We get plenty of those. Cicadas were chirping and insects began to gather around me, so I couldn't just stand out there to be a sitting blood bank. So gripping the talisman around my neck, I went off the dark trail that I would normally be so familiar of that would remind me of home. It didn't feel that way now. That was when I realized that I've never wandered out here before in my life. The 1 kilometer walk to my house never seemed so long before, and it felt like I was a little boy once more. The first trail was between 2 paddy fields, each locked in a low level of water to help rice grow, and the first 100 meters was easy enough because the street lamp still illuminated the way. But beyond that, I had to use the torchlight from my phone to light the path in front of me, just in case there were snakes or scorpions. A whistling wind blew across the farm and I shivered at the sound. I crept along through the narrow trail until I saw the shadow of 3 sugar palms on my right, near the halfway point. I sighed and made a little smile, beginning to feel foolish for being so afraid. Just as I was easing my grip on my talisman, the world was plunged into darkness. The street lamps were all extinguished. Power cuts were common in rural Thailand, but my heart froze, holding my breath in my chest. There was only my phone torch left in front of me and the moon and stars that offered too little light for my city dweller's eyes. I looked around wildly, throwing my torchlight everywhere, and an old prayer chant came naturally to my lips. Then I remembered that there should be only 2 sugar palms instead of 3. I shone my light there and found 2 trees. I heard a plop, a dipping sound into the paddy field behind me and spun around. I saw 2 long stalks of legs. I looked up to a pale, naked, emaciated body and arms as thin as chopsticks. I couldn't scream. My prayer stiffened on my lips and I fell into the muddy paddy field. I dropped my phone. It leaned down, long spidery legs folding, and the face came into the beam of my phone torchlight. Its eyes were pale like the blind, it had wispy hair, and its horrible, horrible mouth had shrunken into a tiny round hole, smaller than my finger. It wheezed air through the hole in a shrill whistle and seemed to speak. When I couldn't reply, huddled in trembling silence, it whistled again, more shrilly, a tortured tone, and brought up 2 white hands as big as palm fronds. To make a Y gesture, putting hands together in a prayer that we Thai people are famous for. The sign meant greeting, thanking, or begging. I knew what it wanted. An old folklore was drilled deeper into me than the constructs of modern-day society, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even control my bladder or utter a prayer. Its expression changed, and the pale eyes grew bloodshot and the whistling suddenly stopped. Out of the hole of its mouth, a long red tongue rolled out and never seemed to end, until it was as long as my arm, then even longer. Bile rose to my throat and I wanted to vomit, but that physical bodily reaction woke me up from my paralysis and I finally screamed. I nodded furiously. I put my hands together to why it returned, and words came blurting out of my soul. I promised it a feast. I told that it would never starve again. I swore that monks would bless its soul so it would suffer no longer. The tongue stopped extending, and then finally retracted. Its hollow eyes met me for a moment and finally stood up on those spindly legs and swayed off into the darkness. The plopping faded away, and it was gone. I stayed where I was, soaked among the rice stalks. I didn't know how long I stayed there, but when the street lamps finally came back, I scrambled back to my feet, grabbed my phone, and sprinted to my parents' home. According to myth, what I had seen was a lost soul. It would roam the spirit lands, forever hungry because its mouth was too small to eat anything. So on Sunday, I immediately went to the temple to pray to alleviate its suffering and bought noodles as offerings placed before the 2 sugar palm trees near my parents' home. The noodles should fit in its tiny mouth. I'm back in Bangkok now, and I begin to wonder what would happen if I didn't know of the ghost or couldn't remember the village's teachings. It would have killed me, there's no doubt, to drain my blood, open my guts, and suck my intestines. So here's my warning to you, traveling foreigners coming to Thailand. I know you would like to travel to rural parts of Thailand for an exotic cultural experience, but please, remember that these are obscure areas cut off from the wider world. Whenever you happen to meet a ghost, pray for it and give it offerings. Be more open-minded and don't wear your rationality as a token of pride. There are many things that you don't understand in this world beyond the scope of cold, hard science. Don't be arrogant. Listen to villagers and respect their ways because superstition might save your life like it has saved mine. I've never told anyone the full story. The meals they gave us at the camp were basic. I mean, really basic. It was rice every day, which would have been cooked at the start of the week and left in a big metallic bin, accompanied by some sort of boiled chicken or tofu. I wouldn't complain though. It was all part of the volunteering experience, I reckoned. Everyone called her P, but I never really knew her real name. She would warn us before every meal. Don't feed the dogs. That's food for you, not them. Some scraggly mutts would appear shortly after we sat on those rigid wooden benches, all big-eyed and sad-faced. I'm not really an animal person, but I have to admit, they melted my heart. If P saw us so much as to think about sneaking them a bit of chicken, all hell would break loose. Don't! No, please, you can't! She'd scream. I never saw the harm in it, just some hungry dogs looking for a few scraps. New starts would come and the old stays would leave on a pretty regular basis, a conveyor belt of young idealists. One of them, a Turkish girl who spoke very little English, ended up breaking P's rule on her first day, and I finally understood. I'd never encountered many feral dogs before that. I mean, not like those wild things. As soon as that girl lowered her hand with that bit of chicken, they were all on her, biting, clawing, and ripping each other apart to get at it. The girl escaped with minor cuts, but those dogs turned on each other. In a flash, they went from cute and smiley to vicious and gnarling. It took me a while to understand it. I was so naive and I'd never seen that much desperation. Thailand is beautiful. The more northern rural parts I was in were surrounded by lush greenery and rolling hills. I was there for 3 months in the summer of 2011. I had just finished a stint at university and wanted to get away and see a bit of the world before I had to embrace the world of work. I found that organization online. It was pretty popular with UK students as well as Americans and Australians. We'd go live in huts and volunteer our time by helping the locals build houses and storage sheds. Then for a few days, the more experienced volunteers would hike into the mountains and go help the rural villages. I mean really rural, hours from the nearest accessible road and with only one small generator which gave the villagers enough electricity to power 1 light bulb each for a few hours a night. It was the bamboo floors that I will always remember, uneven and painful to sleep on, but we never had a choice. The villagers would let us stay in their houses to sleep, with them bunking up with their neighbors temporarily. Then during the day, we'd help out with the field work. The entire village was made up of maybe 20 to 25 houses, a couple of sheds and a building which looked like some sort of village hall. There were 10 of us volunteers, and P came to help translate for us. The first night we were there, an elderly woman invited us all into her house, and we all sat around a huge wok while she cooked up pad thai. It was easily the best one I ate during my whole time in the country. "We are so happy to have you come," P translated as she spoke. "Big, strong men and women to help with the field work." She gestured to a large area of uneven grass and shrubbery behind the rickety bamboo house. We all nodded and smiled. I think we were all thinking about how grateful we were for the things we all took for granted back home. The young men and women all leave. P began to translate for a frail old man who I presumed was the woman's husband. Well, what does he mean by that? I asked P. She smiled knowingly. Once they're old enough, the boys and girls all leave for Chiang Mai or Bangkok to make money or study. Many of them never come back. There's not anything here for them. It hit me that I hadn't seen any villager remotely near my age that whole day. It was all elderly folks and young children. I could empathize with the ones that left though. I mean, once you'd been to the city and experienced all it had to offer, there really was no coming back to that little mountain village. I smiled politely as the old man spoke, and tears welled up in his eyes a little. Pete told us that he had 2 sons and 3 daughters, all of whom had left as soon as they were able to find work in the city. They would send a little bit of money back up occasionally, maybe visit every few years, but they wanted nothing to do with the village. That's why you are needed here, P said before standing and bidding us a good night. The other volunteers seemed happy enough to be there, but I had this lingering feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't qualify it, but it was something about the way P looked while he spoke to her in Thai, like he was telling her more than what she told us. What if one of the villagers hurt themselves or get sick? Where's the nearest hospital? One of the Americans asked. The old man started chuckling at this, obviously understanding the word hospital and what that guy was asking. He gestured to P and spoke a few words. Nearest hospital is 7 hours away if you have a car. No one in the village has car though. They don't go to hospital. P laughed, but it never made me feel too secure. The old man had continued to chuckle and mumbled to P, pointing to a shelf behind us. Villagers use old medicine anyway, tea and herbs that cure any sickness. We all kind of looked at each other, trying to mask our skepticism, but who were we to judge? The next day, we were out toiling on the fields. Our job was fairly simple. Strip away all the shrubbery and rocks and flatten out the patch of land and square off. Then we had to dig these little trenches which were a few feet long and the same deep so that the villagers could plant their seeds. We had primitive-looking tools to do this though. Rickety hoes with broken handles and a couple of spades. We were happy though. The villagers needed this patch to grow rice and we were the only ones that were fit enough to do it under that baking hot sunshine. The kids from the village would watch us and giggle as we worked. We must have been the first non-Thai people they had ever seen in the flesh. The group was pretty diverse too, like some front page of a university syllabus. There was a couple of Indian guys, a few black guys, a Mexican girl, and a few white guys and girls. It must have been weird for all the kids, I suppose. For all of the giggling kids, though, there were a few glum faces that stared out at us, probably a little frightened, I guess. They always kept their distance too, never venturing any closer than 20 feet from us. I put it down to their fear at the start, but noticed that whenever any of the kids got closer to us, their guardians would scream at them in a harsh tone. I came to the conclusion that it was the older ones who were actually afraid of us for some reason. We hadn't really met anyone besides from the old men and women who were feeding us. Everyone I met in Thailand during my entire visit had been cheerful and happy to see us there, but the people in that village, there was this weird kind of solemn mood that hung over the place which made me feel a little uneasy. I shouldn't have wandered that night. I mean, they never specifically told us not to, but I think P kind of suggested that we just stay in our dorms after dark. I liked most of the people in my group, but spending days in such close quarters with anyone will eventually drive you a bit insane. So I stepped out for a little bit of air and looked at the stars, which were beautiful, by the way. Something about the crisp mountain air and lack of any sort of pollution that seemed to amplify the night sky. I was standing there, gulping upwards when I heard the noise. It was like a groan, but a little more high-pitched. I spun my head around, expecting to see some sort of animal, maybe a dog or a cat, but nothing was there. The groaning grew louder as I navigated the muddy lanes looking for its source. Eventually, I found myself standing a few yards from the town hall building. Whatever was making that noise was coming from inside there, an agonizing groan and heaving. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself, edging closer cautiously. The ground was made up of loose mud and rocks, so I was careful not to make too much noise or lose my footing. The sound of twisted gurgling began to fill my ears as I reached for the bamboo shutter. I had to see what was in there, making all those inhuman noises. A sharp tug of my arm spun me around, and I was face to face with the elderly woman who fed us, grinning from ear to ear as she spoke. "No, no, no, only us," gesturing towards the building. "That noise." I gestured to my ear, pleading with her to tell me what the hell was going on. She just kept smiling and tugging at my arm, pulling me away from the building. I didn't want to get into a wrestling match with an elderly Thai woman, so I went with the flow, but never taking my eyes off of that little building. "No, no, no, only us, not you there," she kept on repeating and smiling at me. P met us as we neared the house I was sleeping in, yelling something in Thai at that woman. I'm sorry, it's just, there's something in that building over there," I stammered with pleading eyes towards P, who in turn began motioning to the elderly woman. After a brief exchange, P took my arm from the woman and continued with the process of dragging me away. "I told you, no wandering at night, please. Go back to house." "What was that? What did she say?" "Not important. It's only important that you stay away from there. Please respect their privacy." I have to admit, I did feel like a bit of a jerk when she said that. I mean, sure, it was freaky and it did shake me up, but at the end of the day, it probably looked like some obnoxious foreigner barging in and demanding to know what was going on. As it turned out, that was going to be our last night there anyway. To this day, I swear I could hear that groaning and hissing noise from the house where I was sleeping, although I never actually slept a wink that night. It was one of those things that shakes you. You know it's not right, but you just can't figure out why. Now I know, though. It's a lot worse than I could have ever imagined. I hadn't noticed the little girl approaching us while we dug. I don't think anyone did. She must have been about 4, maybe a little older, and was kind of frail looking. She wore a friendly smile on her face, then tugged at the sleeves of one of the American girls in our group, then presented her with a blue flower. "Aw, thank you, sweetie. Isn't that just beautiful?" The girl from our group dropped to one knee and gave the little girl a squeeze. She giggled and placed her arms around the American's neck. It was a beautiful scene. I remember thinking about the differences in our cultures and privileges as I watched these two worlds meet in a warm embrace. A shrill shriek pierced through the air and my perception faded quickly. My spade hit the mud as I twitched, startled by an approaching sound. It was a woman, one of the villagers, running towards us at full speed and screaming at the top of her lungs. Before any of us could react, she was over the American girl, and with one swift motion of surprising strength, she threw her backwards. The deranged-looking woman began barking at us unintelligibly and pointing at the chalk-faced American on the ground. The little girl had taken off in fits of tears as she approached us slowly. I remember how red and swollen her eyes looked, and the contorted look of pain on her face. I had never seen anything like that before. She edged closer and closer, the American girl on the ground now scrambling back towards the group and screaming at the woman to back off. P's shouts filtered through the air, and we all turned to face her as she ran towards us, waving her arms. She grabbed the woman by the arm and dragged her back. The woman was a mess of tears and howls by that point. P calmed her down eventually, and she fell down to the ground with a weary thud. The other villagers had formed a line on top of the hill, staring at us motionlessly as the situation unfolded. It was unsettling, to say the least. "Get your belongings. We go right now." P barked at us, and we all obliged without a second thought, dropping our tools and hurriedly moving back to the houses. The villagers parted like the Red Sea as we approached the hill, falling back from us with a look of fear in their eyes. "What the hell is going on?" I heard someone say as we packed and followed P back to the mountain pass. It was still a good few hours' hike until we could reach the road, but no one spoke the whole way. We just marched silently throughout the hillside, trying to get back before nightfall. Now, I've told a few people this, but it's not the whole story. The bit I always miss out is the bit I've never mentioned to anyone, not even the others in my group. It was as we left, trudging up the steep hill to the mountain pass, that I realized I left my phone at the ridge where we'd taken a rest. It was about a 10-minute jog back, and the atmosphere among the group was so strange that I decided to slip away silently, then catch up with them. When I reached the ridge, I quickly located my iPhone and then turned to meet with the group again, when something caught my attention. I realized from a few meters to the west of the ridge there was a point where I could see over the entire village, like a perfect vantage point. My curiosity got the better of me, and I peered down that steep incline to the place where we'd spent the last few days. The villagers had formed a line, almost. They were all standing in a straight line from that village hall building, spread out all the way to the garden we had worked on. Then I noticed the boxes, wooden crates that were silently passing from one person to the next, all the way to the garden. That feeling of naivety and horror washed over me again. The penny had finally dropped. None of us had realized what we were actually doing. The patch of land we had leveled, the trenches we had dug, we had been digging graves, small graves. I watched on with a sickening feeling in my stomach as they lowered the little boxes into the holes. By the time I had caught up with the group, they realized I was missing, and P wore a furious expression which faded away when she saw my chalk-white face. In that moment, she realized what I had seen, and I realized that she'd known all along. She broke eye contact with me and yelled something about hurrying up before nightfall. I'm not entirely sure I believe in ghosts, to be honest. Even after all of this happened, I'm still a little skeptical about ghosts and hauntings, though I'll bite on some of the other paranormal things that go down in the woods or the mountains at night. Of course, this changes my mind a little. For a little background, I'm half Thai, half American. My mother is full-blooded Thai and had lived there for most of her life. She moved to the US after I was born in Bangkok. Every 2 years or so, my sister, my mother, and I fly to Thailand to see my cousins, aunts and uncles, and my grandparents. They're fairly poor, so they can't afford a plane ticket to see us in America. And besides, it's a nice vacation for my sister and I, so we can get away from our rigorous academic lives and meet family again. In 2012, we flew down to Bangkok and drove to Ayutthaya, another older city, to get to our bed and breakfast sitting at the Chao Phraya River. My mother had chosen it specifically because it wasn't too expensive, and it had a beautiful view of the oldest Buddhist temple in Thailand, which was just across the river. I would have thought she had known better. By the time we got to the bed and breakfast, it was late at night. Someone had taken my luggage on accident, so we were all laughing about how confused they were going to be, opening a suitcase full of books and expensive bras. We'd just been on a plane for over 24 hours, driven for another 2, and all of us were exhausted. There were only 2 beds, so my sister crashed on one, and my mother and I crashed on the other. By then, it was almost 4 in the morning. That night, I had a strange experience. I'm not sure how to describe it. I knew that I was still asleep. My body was still, and my mother was next to me, and it was still nighttime. Yet I could feel myself being dragged out of my body. It was like someone had gripped me by the feet and was trying to pull me out of bed while leaving my flesh behind. I remember fighting against it, trying to stay in my body for what seemed like a long time. It was a little scary, as if someone had reached inside and was repeatedly yanking me away. The room was lit with a weird yellow glow from the street lamp. Things seemed bright and harsh in my memory, but I couldn't see what it was that grabbed me. I remember watching my hip pass my line of sight before I was suddenly released and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I thought nothing of it. I get sleep paralysis frequently, but this was different. In sleep paralysis, I had always tried to move but couldn't. This was the exact opposite. I was trying to stay still and something else was trying to move me. For whatever reason, it didn't bother me much. I dismissed it. I went down to the riverside and had breakfast, sat on a deck and called my boyfriend, decided to take it easy and forget about it. Then my mom came downstairs and sat on the riverside with me. The two of us had a short conversation. I can't remember what it was about. Somehow we got on the subject of the temple. It was old, dating back to the 1300s. They say that ghosts like to hang around temples a lot. Most people don't like to sleep around temples at night, my mother told me. Especially old temples. Very spooky. At the time, it seemed just like another footnote. My mother was chock full of information about the cities around Bangkok and Korat, where she lived. Still, it stuck with me for a while, thinking of the temple across the river with its high walls and its ancient history as the place where all the dead of the old capital were taken to be buried after Burma burned the city to ashes. For the next couple of nights, things went on as normal. We went sightseeing, visited tourist spots, and rode on a ferry with some old friends of ours. Then, one day, my mother asked me while we were alone, "Do you remember that first night at the bed and breakfast?" "Of course I do," I said. I still vividly remembered being yanked out of my body. It's not an experience you easily forget. It was so strange that first night. I had a horrible dream that night that there were two young men in our room. They were digging through all of our things and looking at us. I could feel that they were dangerous, she said quietly. I frowned and listened. I remember trying to protect you and your sister. I wanted them to leave. In my dream, I couldn't move, so I prayed to Jesus, asking for help that they would leave us alone, my mom told me. She was a recent convert to Christianity, having been a Buddhist most of her life, and I converted that very summer as well. Yet, it had never crossed my mind to pray while I was attacked. My mother was a very spiritual person, and she was incredibly open to the supernatural. I was less inclined. Still, I was curious. Did they leave? I asked, after you prayed. My mother nodded, and that was the end of that. I thought on it, trying to assess the validity of her dream. While I was a Christian, I was also studying to be a scientist. After all, it could have just been a dream. Yet the fact that she had felt spiritually attacked the same night I had also felt spiritually attacked while sleeping near a Thai temple after being so mentally exhausted seemed an odd kind of coincidence to me, especially after experiencing the sudden release from whatever it was that had attacked me in my sleep. Thai folklore is full of ghosts, and perhaps that was what my mother drew upon. Perhaps I just dreamt the whole thing up. Perhaps becoming a new convert to religion had left me open to spiritual ideas and fears. Either way, while that was my first time encountering ghosts in Thailand, it wasn't the last. I haven't asked my sister if she ever dreamt of anything. Perhaps one day I will.